A major escalation today in Russia's war on Ukraine. The White House already announcing new sanctions that, in response to Vladimir Putin this morning, making it official, illegally annexing parts of Ukraine. Western governments across the globe condemning the move, which is a clear violation of international law. In that signing ceremony you see right there, President Putin says those territories, in his view, now part of Russia. His words, forever.
I want the Kiev authorities and their real masters in the West to hear me and remember those people who live in these 4 regions are becoming our citizens forever.
Our Chief White House correspondent Caitlin Collins standing by outside the White House. First, though, let's get to Nick Payton-Wall. She's in Kramatorsk. Nick, walk us through, from your perspective on the ground, what happened today and what are its implications for the war?
Well, I think what happened today was what everybody had been expecting, which is Russia formally declaring, with a huge degree of falsehood in each statement, that even where I'm standing here in Ukraine is now effectively Russia. The problem they have, of course, is that the 4 areas they say that are now Russia, they do not militarily control. All of them, particularly here in Donetsk and Luhansk. What we saw in Moscow, though, was a bid by Putin to cast this, as he always has, in a revisionist historical way, as Russia and even the Soviet Union are essentially being victimized by the West and forced into a position to protect the wider Russian Slavic people. Nonsense, frankly, if you consider the extraordinary damage they've done to the people they claim to protect since they invaded in February. But it was a clear message, and one certainly which you saw slightly bewildered, shocked faces in that Kremlin hall, perhaps not entirely sharing the view of reality or of the world as it currently is that Vladimir Putin was trying to extol. What does it mean on the ground here, though? Well, Vladimir Putin didn't directly threaten to use nuclear weapons to protect the territory he now claims is Russia, which his officials have done in the past week. He hinted at that possibility, but it was not something he specifically said. So we are still now facing a situation where Russia's conventional forces are losing. They're not using this partial mobilization to get enough people to the front to change the dynamic here. And we're certainly seeing, even when he was speaking, Ukrainian forces moving forwards, particularly around a strategic hub here called Liman. It's a railway town that's pretty much encircled now by Ukrainian forces, with thousands of important, well-equipped Russian troops effectively cut off and stranded there. That could cause another potential domino effect near where I'm standing of further Russian territorial losses. We'll have to wait and see. But we have remarkably seen Ukraine on their front forward, dismissing this annexation, frankly, as no consequence, asking to quickly join NATO if possible. They've always wanted that, but it injects an extra level of geopolitical tension at this important time. And Ukraine saying they will continue to liberate land here. So, for all the pageantry in Moscow, fears that Russia may feel it has other cards to play, but no change to the ground here. John?
Payton-Wall on the ground for us in Ukraine. Caitlin Collins, let's go to the White House. Now, the White House very quick to announce new sanctions, but what is their perspective strategically? Putin can look at that map we just had on the screen. He took Crimea 14 years ago. He thinks he's going to hold these territories. What is the White House plan to make that not so?
Well, that's a big question for the White House, which is not just that they're condemning it, but what do they believe happens next? Because if you listen to that speech from President Putin today, he basically framed this as this existential crisis between the West and Russia. And he spoke in these very brazen terms about how he views this conflict and where it's going from here. And so the White House is condemning the move that they knew was coming with the illegal annexation of these 4 Ukrainian territories. They are saying it is brazen, that it is a violation of international law. It tramples on the United Nations Charter. And as President Biden said today in a statement, showing its contempt for peaceful nations everywhere by doing this. And they are also taking action, John, imposing these sanctions and working on really trying to further cripple Russia's technology and defense sectors. That's by going after companies that they say, or entities that provide any kind of political or economic support to Russia's illegal annexation of these 4 territories. They say that they will impose sanctions. They will put in place these export controls. That's a step that they're taking. They're also targeting top Russian officials here with this newest round of sanctions, John. But a big question is going to be the bigger ones here of, with Ukraine saying that they are going to submit this application to join NATO, that they want it to be an expedited process. What is the White House's response to that? We haven't seen that so far. President Biden did say earlier he will be speaking on this later today about this move from Russia, in addition to the statement that he put out and what we heard from the Treasury and Commerce departments on this latest round of an attempt to punish it. But also, it's raising a bigger question of how this conflict could potentially end, especially with that speech from President Putin today.
After the Kremlin held its celebration ceremony, Vladimir Zelensky made his next move. The Ukrainian president announced his country is fast-tracking its NATO membership application under an accelerated procedure. He called Moscow's, quote, attempted annexation a farce, and he accused the Russian leader of wanting to rewrite history and redraw borders with murders, torture, blackmail, and lies. CNN's Matthew Chance joins me now live from New York. Matthew, Putin formalizing these regions as Russian territory has far-reaching consequences. Could you take us through what he says it will mean while Ukraine is still trying to reclaim lost ground?
Yeah, well, it's a big escalation, of course, of the conflict in the sense that Russia has incorporated these 4 regions now formally. I mean, that's going to be subject to the rubber stamp approval of the Russian parliament, into the Russian Federation. And of course, it's a powerful message that Vladimir Putin is sending, both to his domestic audience, because it sort of reiterates the Kremlin propaganda line that these regions actually wanted to join Russia. But also it's a strong message to the international community as well, that despite the fundamental opposition that's been expressed to him and to Russia doing this, he's going to do it anyway, regardless of the consequences. And, more than that, he is going to, and he said this, he's going to defend these territories with everything Russia's got, if necessary. And he said, even though he's open to peace talks with Ukraine, which is encouraged, the future of these territories will not be on the table. And so, this is Vladimir Putin doing what he always does, which is when he's backed into a corner, he doubles down. He doesn't back down, he doubles down. And that's what he's doing now. It leads us, of course, into a very dangerous, very unpredictable area in which we've got, Russia saying that this is now Russian territory, and if you attack it, we'll potentially use our nuclear deterrent to combat that. While there's a massive offensive going on by the Ukrainians, with the Ukrainians making territorial advances in that part of Ukraine. So again, a very, very dangerous situation.
Yeah, exactly. And Antony Blinken was actually worried about whether it was going to be annexed and what that would mean if Putin sees it as Russian territory. I want you to take a listen to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He spoke a short while ago, and he said that the territory is still considered Ukrainian. Listen in.
This land grab is illegal and illegitimate. NATO allies do not and will not recognize any of this territory as part of Russia. We call on all states to reject Russia's blatant attempts at territorial conquest. These lands are Ukraine.
All right, but what does that mean to Moscow, Matthew? What do these words mean for Moscow?
Well, frankly, I don't think it's going to have much impact on Moscow. The fact that the Secretary General of NATO doesn't acknowledge this. More importantly, I think the Ukrainians themselves have obviously categorically rejected this annexation, and they've said that they are going to accelerate their application to join the NATO, the Western Military Alliance, NATO. And so I think what will be really interesting to hear is what Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of the Western Military Alliance, has to say about that. Obviously, it's pretty unlikely at this point, I would say, that NATO would embrace Ukraine as it's in full-blown confrontation with nuclear-armed Russia. But, who knows? This conflict is escalating at a dramatic and unpredictable and frightening pace at the moment.
Yeah, and it's such a good point. I was sort of reflecting on what Vladimir Putin said a week ago, and he says, look, I'm not bluffing, when he was talking about nuclear weapons or escalation. We're seeing images coming through from Russia right now. There's still a celebration on the go. Vladimir Putin still very much engaging with an audience and declaring victory. You were talking about this being an escalation, but again, you know, any use of nuclear weapons, any nuclear risk is going to have dire consequences for all sides.
Yeah, it would. And it wouldn't necessarily make a difference in terms of military gains either. I mean, if Vladimir Putin kills 1 million people in a nuclear attack, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, Ukraine falls under his sway. But look, these images are really striking that we're seeing now. This is a highly choreographed bit of nationalistic fervour in the centre of the very beautiful Russian capital, with people attending this concert as Russia proclaims the annexation of these 4 regions of Ukraine. You can hear them chanting "Russia, Russia" now, and obviously they're being told to do that. I don't think the mood across the country this is a reflection of that necessarily. Remember, in the past couple of weeks, or the past couple of days even, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people try to make their way to the exits of Russia to escape the military draft. The reality of the special military operation in Ukraine, which has been very costly in terms of human life on the Russian side as well as on the Ukrainian side, has really hit home with Russians, and that impact is going to continue to sour attitudes towards it.